Welcome to Europe Calling in cooperation with Michael Bloss today. He's going to join us shortly, and the topic is EU taxonomy for sustainable financial investment. And there is a coalition of the very relevant committees in the Parliament. My name is Maximilian Fries. I am the Managing Director of Europe Calling. Just technical information for you. You can see the structure and the input statements for today, our keynote speakers, and then the panel discussion, and then the audience discussion. As always, you can ask questions too, and we're going to try to answer them. And you can vote questions up if you agree with them, if you like them, if you'd like to hear the answer. And the link in order to ask those questions or to vote questions up has been posted in the chat just now. And if there's time, we are also going to answer oral questions spontaneously from the audience. Then you can just raise your hand. So Michael Bloss has also joined us now. Perfect timing. So we're recording this as always, and we're live on YouTube. So if you'd like to ask your questions and you're saying your name, you're introducing yourselves, just know that that will be on YouTube too. So that's it on logistics. Welcome again if you've just joined us, and we're going to start with our first speaker, Christina Jeromien. Since April 2018, she's the co-managing director of Sustainable Financial Cluster Germany, and since March 2021, deputy chair of the Sustainable Finance Advisory Council of the federal government. So, Christina, what's the taxonomy about and why is it important? Thank you, Dr. Fries. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Well, in order to really start this discussion, it's important to talk about the instrument and the purpose of the taxonomy in the wider discussion, namely sustainable investments, financial investments. So basically, the EU Commission's purpose under its action plan, Sustainable Finance, wanted to make sure that there are targeted, that there should be targeted investments in the social and environmental direction, and to accompany this. And that is very ambitious because this transformation has three different pillars. So the first one, those areas and sectors that are not yet sustainable and not on the path to 1.5 degrees under the Paris Agreement should be transformed in order to get there, also in order to achieve the UN targets. So the capital market can help, or the Commission, and then also other sectors that are no longer sustainable, can no longer be afforded, should be phased out in a socially compatible way. And then, of course, sustainable areas of business should be supported. So if you're looking at the fact that this is a closer cooperation between politics and science and a civil community, it means that we have clear transformation paths. And on this journey, we constantly have to check whether we are getting closer to the targets that we have set ourselves, or whether we have to invest more, do more. And for this process of evaluation and for the success of this transformational process, and in order to make it a success, you need a common definition. What is sustainable? How do we define sustainable? Because there are very heterogeneous standards in finance and in the economy. There are different types of ratings. And in terms of the future, how future-proof investments are, there are different standards. And at the moment, there are some greenwashing scandals in the media. There have been some such scandals, and that shows how different the interpretations is. And so the developments are not exactly what we would like to see, especially when you're looking at the phasing out of some core businesses that are not sustainable. So the taxonomy is the core, the heart, and it just of the EU Commission's plan, and it just means a classification, and it's supposed to serve as a common definition. So what do you mean when we say sustainable, and how can we evaluate different activities and investments in order to see do they serve in order to achieve our targets, and do they not do any harm in adjacent areas? So do they not have any negative impacts on other targets? And there's a technical expert group which established this taxonomy proposal. Unfortunately, has been watered down because in the beginning, nuclear power and fossil gas were excluded from the taxonomy for various different reasons. Nuclear power mainly one requirement for all companies where you say the principle of do no significant harm is applicable. It doesn't really work for nuclear power. It's always possible that there's an accident with significant damage to humans and the environment, and of course afterwards as well. So they were that was included, and the same for gas. It wasn't completely excluded from the beginning, but there was upper limit, 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour was the upper limit. So that was the principle in the first proposal. But then at the beginning of the year, there was some bad news because of pressure from individual member states. The Commission decided to include fossil gas and nuclear power in their taxonomy. So this is a classification system for sustainable services, environmental services by companies. And so for the first time, you now have energy policy aspects and questions and issues. So before nuclear, the reasons for nuclear power and gas for including that was that this network, the energy grid wouldn't be stable, that we need those in order to achieve our targets. But the taxonomy isn't the right place in order to include this because of course you need a transition period in any such measure, for any such measure, but that doesn't mean that you have to include such things in the classification, because that just makes the classification, the whole classification, absurd. Because if you're saying nuclear power is suddenly labeled as sustainable, that is absurd, as I said. So the main reason in order to start this classification was to look at their environmental service, and this is just not that. So maybe this proposal will be adopted, but it will do incredible damage to the reputation of the EU Commission, because the question is there really the political will for such a transformation and high ambition? And that is an important question. It's important to understand that this transformation, which can't depend on legislative periods, it's going to take decades. We need this common definition, and it needs to be stable over decades. So if we're starting out with a watered down proposal, it will wreak havoc and do damage to reputation that will barely be something that you can fix. I am from the sector, and if politicians do not show the political will, then we will fall back and stay behind what's possible really. So Just imagine a financial investor, and these products that are labeled as sustainable would also be nuclear power and gas products. And as soon as that's the case, it's no longer credible also for the population, for the general population. So we have banks and investors, and they also manage private clients, ordinary people's money, and they would then be able to invest it for them in such products. So that's a problem. At that moment, they wouldn't be able to really manage that money according to what the original purpose was. And for the financial sector, the risk is huge, because they have to be reliable for their clients. That's the basic assumption. And as soon as we don't have any reliable standards for them to operate, then we don't have any future-proof models in the financial sector and no credibility. And talking about responsibility of the EU Commission, there's also the point that we don't even know exactly what the watered-down proposal, what the effects will be in terms of actually achieving our climate goals, because the expert group, of course, tried to draw up something that would help reach the EU climate goals. So that proposal, as it stands now, does not have a scientific basis, and it's not clear how the targets that have been set would be achieved now. And then this sustainable finance debate, there's another point that I would like to mention, especially now with the taxonomy. Many people say it's all too complicated, and companies wouldn't be able to work with that. So in just sticking to the targets and also use this standardized taxonomy, that would be too complicated. That's another argument. But if we're saying that such complexity is a negative criterion and makes it impossible to work with such standards, then that's wrong, because of course the world is complicated and complex, and this complexity has been reduced in the past, and that is why we're on the wrong path. We've only looked at companies looking at the classic financial indicators, so value added chains have not been taken into account correctly and in their completeness. And so that's why we already have so many risks and issues. Complexity is nothing negative. It's positive, meaning that just when all the information is on the table, that's the only way you can really act responsibly with your investments and make the right decisions. And this complexity is an ambition that should be met. It doesn't mean that when companies fear that they may not be able to work with this, that we just ignore them. But we have to start in a serious manner. And if we don't do that, then I doubt that we can actually use this in a positive way, this opportunity.
Vielen Dank. Ich würde auch jetzt direkt weitergeben zu Luisa Neubauer.
Thank you very much for this great introduction. Let's switch to Luisa Neubauer while the world is speeding past her in the train. Mrs. Neubauer, what's the opinion of the climate movement on taxonomy and on what's happening in the European Parliament? That's what we'd like to know, and we're happy to have you as a speaker. Let's hope the connection is stable. Yes, I hope the quality is enough. Otherwise, please let me know. Let's jump right in while the connection is still stable, because I'm on the way to the Austrian Climate Summit. There are three dimensions, I think, which are underestimated. Who's financing the climate targets? This is often forgotten. Often enough, we're being told that climate protection is too expensive, especially for consumers, but it basically boils down to the question, Where does the capital for climate destruction come from? And who's actually building a business case for climate protection or against it? And this is often disregarded also because it's seen as a complex topic. Climate movements as well might talk about compensation mechanisms, carbon pricing, global systems, and you have to talk about redistribution and initiation payments. Often enough, this topic is not covered enough. If someone's financing climate destruction, you can't expect him to help you with climate protection. And that's what makes fossil energy so undemocratic. They need a huge investment and therefore concentrate power around themselves, around the infrastructure, and power is being given to those controlling the infrastructure. So if you're talking about fossil energies, you're also talking about democracy and about power distribution. And you have to be very strict and consequent because it's an ecological question, it's a question of liberty, but also of democracy. Unfortunately, the connection's interrupted. Often enough, we're talking about renewables and the necessary investments, but the financial aspect is being left aside. We have to start recognizing and taking seriously as a civil society and as a movement the nature of our task being a process of redistribution, because there are massive financial flows going into the fossil energies, and these have to be disrupted. Also, as a reaction to the war in Ukraine, we are seeing a rise in inflation, which is also aggravating the climate crisis. Several projects, for example, such as Nord Stream 2, are not being finalized. And here we see a clear need for investments in sustainable options. This is not just a one-way road. And this just shows us how important finance is concerning climate protection as well. And you shouldn't be afraid of this topic. You should also voice your opinion. So we have to organize and to talk about this topic also in the climate movements. The second dimension has been already mentioned by Ms. Jeromin. It's very important to understand the banking world, and often enough you're given the impression that private persons shouldn't meddle with this, that it's too complex, but you have to consider that there's public money being invested and transferred, money of millions of people in Europe. And there are certain duties as well for the banks. The idea that we should have to ask for permission to actually deal with this topic and be given information, understand what's happening in the name and the responsibility of the people, leads to several questions. Then others say taxonomy is to be complicated for the finance industry. I just think, well, if you're working with numbers, I think you should be able to work with taxonomy and understand this topic if it's your job. So I don't think you have to protect the banks from this. And if it's going into the other direction, you see there are apparently no obstacles and no fees for the finance industry. And some final thoughts. greenwashing. As a climate movement and Fridays for Future, we found greenwashing to be quite boring. We were thinking, well, maybe there's too much publicity on being green, maybe too much talking about it, but it's actually more serious. We changed our opinion after the very intense protests. We have really made a U-turn. So our strategy is we should clearly avoid greenwashing. And it's certainly a big dynamic going on in public and in politics. So it's no coincidence how the taxonomy turned out. The business case actually doesn't change, and this leads to a counterintuitive, destructive, almost absurd and embarrassing greenwashing. We also see this with different banks, for example, Deutsche Bank. I also spoke at an event recently, and the Deutsche Bank representatives obviously said they align with the Paris climate agreements. But then there's an 8 billion credit being given to Total several days afterwards. So you can clearly see they're all over the place, and this probably won't have been the last greenwashing case we have to address. There will be a huge movement in the industry with the investors and the finance markets. So we have to draw a clear red line and tell them, no, you can't do this. The EU won't let you do this, nor do we, nor does the public. But if this taxonomy is actually adopted, what kind of signal do we send out? And if we're being very evident in saying the taxonomy is greenwashed, etc., then you risk just ending up being classified as, well, another case of stupid greenwashing. But that's not it. It has huge consequences, which we have to take very serious. So we can't just sit still and do nothing about it. Thank you very much. I'm happy the connection hasn't been interrupted. And as you said, there are very many meta questions and dimensions. We could debate a long time about this, and I'm happy to have the time afterwards for a brief discussion at least. Next up is Sven Giegold. He was once a member of parliament. Now he's in the Federal Ministry for Economy and Climate Protection. And the German government also has a position on taxonomy. Dear Sven Giegold, what's the position of the German government and what's to expect in the future? The easy answer would be the delegated act we're talking about is to be rejected, but the project of the taxonomy is to be supported. But obviously, I don't want to give just an easy answer. And I don't think we have to be very formal here in German, talking with Sie instead of du, because in the European Parliament, only the Nazis are saying Sie. So I'll stick to du in German. In any case, my role is somewhat difficult, and I want to be transparent about it. While I was still a colleague of Michael and more or less of a colleague with René, because we haven't been working at the same time, we organized huge petitions against this delegated act, together with Kristina and stakeholders from the economy. And we were saying, it's not possible that this great idea for Europe on investment rules suddenly declares nuclear power and gas as being sustainable. We collected many signatures and now my role has changed. So formally, what I am saying are also what the German government would say. So I'll somehow have to adopt my style. I'll try to be as creative as possible with these limitations, but please just be aware. I'm now the state secretary responsible for Europe, and I'm leading for the Fit for 55, which Micha especially knows very well and has done a lot for in the parliament. And Fit for 55 is connected with the taxonomy. So I have been contributing to these negotiations in the name of the German government at a European level. So let's make some things clear. Taxonomy is a transparency standard which defines which part of a company and its assets, be it a bank or a financial company, how many investments are subject to certain criteria. So the EU defines sustainable investments. And if you're under this umbrella, you get a green label. And then you have the other investments. The taxonomy doesn't prohibit anything. It's just a transparency standard. This means the debate on what the taxonomy can do and cannot is somewhat exaggerated. Why? If I transparently declare in a financial market how many green investments are being made, this doesn't mean that there won't be any other investments. But we have the basic principle being markets clear. As long as dirty investments are worth it, there will also be stakeholders financing them. You can't think it's possible to substitute on the financial market what we don't achieve with other intentions to change the behavior of the people. And this also applies to fair work and other aspects of work. This means taxonomy can't just substitute this transition, but it can achieve transparency on how far we are on this way. And in every company, you have someone who wants to stick to the old business model, and you have other people who want an ecological and social change. If we achieve transparency, the right people are being strengthened, and those who are on the brakes are being weakened. Often enough, people point out it would be very complex or a lot of effort, but this is a strange argument. The taxonomy creates a unique standard for everyone, while nowadays the different banks and also the big companies have their own sustainability standards. They just differ. If you read the implementation manuals of different companies, this is a lot more complicated than what the European Union is planning now. The same also applies to the supply chain rules. If there is a European manufacturer who's doing well, this is a much better solution. And the same holds true for the taxonomy. If you have one common standard, this is much easier and much better. The Greens actually paved the way for this because we demanded the Commission should present such a strategy in the past. So I was very angry to learn that once we had done the whole procedure at the European Union, that now the Commission would present a delegated act, which wasn't foreseen. And this delegated act implied that nuclear power and gas and investments therein would be labeled as sustainable. This decision was, as far as I see it, a very unnecessary concession towards Emmanuel Macron. The Parliament actually had a vote on this and rejected this idea. And European law has a principle. The fundamental content has to be regulated in an own law and not in a delegated act. And now that this vote has been lost to some, the Commission chooses the alternative way of a delegated act, which has not the obligation to be adopted democratically in the same way in the Parliament and the Council. So I'm not amused, to put it mildly. And when it was clear that this delegated act would be realized, the German government also stepped in, and there was a compromise being found, which didn't belong to any of the parties, neither to the SPD, Greens, or FDP. And we don't want nuclear power to be labeled as sustainable. Then others ask us, why don't you say the same for gas? That's the green position. And I'm still convinced that both nuclear power and gas shouldn't be considered classified. If you have a look at green bonds and sustainable finance products on the market, you won't find nuclear power or gas. The market standard already excludes them. In any case, we dealt with these negotiations in the way of a compromise, but something different was being decided by the government without any additional security standards or sustainability standards. The government declared nuclear power as sustainable. This also wasn't what Mr. Macron wanted. He wanted them to be dealt the same way as renewable energies are dealt with, but nuclear power is still included to a large extent. This is why we're not happy with the result, and the European Commission, together with other European countries, achieved that gas investments can only be classified as sustainable under certain conditions. And beginning from 2035, fossil gas has to be excluded. I have to say that gas doesn't have to be fossil, it can also be produced sustainably, because it depends on where it comes from. If you use hydrogen, for example, or biogas being produced from waste, which is technically possible, also not done very often, you can reach very low carbon levels and recycle it in a circular way. And this pressure heading for more restrictions didn't come from us, actually, but from inside the commissions, I have to admit. Still, the result is somewhat absurd, because given the context of Putin's war on Ukraine, we have the idea that gas is a relevant part of gas being a relevant part of the transition towards a cleaner future seems to be very outdated. So we will reject this, but we can't do anything in the council because we would need 20 out of 27 states to reject the proposal. I could debate at length with René if this is actually correct, 20 out of 27, but that's the opinion of the council secretary, so you can't change anything. So our only hope is what happens tomorrow and at the European Parliament's plenary. We'll need a majority in the environmental and in the economic commission, and then an absolute majority in the plenary rejecting this. So I'd very much hope to finish this debate tomorrow, and then it's done. And probably the Commission will be so embarrassed to never ever present such a proposal again. Emmanuel Macron has also been re-elected, so that's one problem that's solved as well. So we could just analyze what went well and what didn't. It certainly hasn't been certainly hasn't been a great performance by many, so I hope tomorrow we're successful and then it's over.
Über die Monate auch nachvollzogen haben.
Thank you, Sven. As always, that was really good, and we followed this topic over many months now. Now we'll continue with Michael Bloss, an MEP, part of the party that raised the objection. So what is it about? What exactly does it say? What exactly are you going to vote on tomorrow? And do you think that it will be successful tomorrow in the vote? Yes, just like Mr. Giegold says, oh no, we're on a first name basis now. I was just joking. Well, of course, we would like to stop it, and René, Repasi, and I would like to be successful. We need a majority. And that means more than the S&D and the Green Party. But it's really a very delicate balance at the moment. We're counting and we're about equal now. So there are 149 votes in the Environment and Economic Committee because they're voting together, and we need a majority. Both camps are at about 65 votes right now. And just now I heard that all CDU, CSU, German conservative MEPs are going to vote with us tomorrow. So we have that part of the conservatives on our side, which makes it more likely that we will win tomorrow. But that's only a first step tomorrow. And it's only a simple majority that we need tomorrow because it's a vote in person. So only those who are present can vote, which also makes things easier. And then in 3 weeks, it has to be an absolute majority. That means the majority of the actual MEPs, which means 353 votes is what we need for our objection. That's going to be more difficult. But if we win tomorrow, at least then we're showing the world that it's winnable, because at the moment people have lost faith. And that will create a dynamic and a debate. And then people will start thinking about the question and really think about, are you really in favor of including nuclear power and gas and putting them on the same level as renewable energies? So we're hoping that will get people thinking again. So in the objection itself, it doesn't say a lot, Max. Only 2 paragraphs, really. Just something like, with a view to science and democracy, we are democracy. We're rejecting this second delegated legal act, and we would like to submit this to the Commission because we had it ready. It's not just me who signed it. It was really an alliance, the Liberals, the CDU, the Green Party, the Renew, etc., and left MEPs. So MEPs from many groups have signed it because there are many reasons to and MEPs have signed it for different reasons and oppose it for different reasons. That's their choice. So there is no reasoning in the objection itself. There's this advisory platform on the taxonomy. They have issued an opinion on it, and they said, so if we include gas in this taxonomy up until 2035 at least, then we're allowing the taxonomy to have on average a higher CO2 higher CO2 emissions than emissions in Europe at the moment. I mean, that is impossible. We're trying to achieve 1.5 degrees, but we're actually have a taxonomy of 1.4 billion tons of CO2 that would be emitted. And on average, that would be higher than CO2 emissions in Europe now, and 3 times more than what France emits in 1 year. So it's important to have that kind of these scientific arguments that we cannot label this as sustainable. And looking at nuclear power, the Commission assumes that we have safe final storage sites, but that is not the case, not for highly radioactive waste. So it's not true that such sites have been found. That's why we're also referring to democracy. This is really a way to circumvent parliamentary processes, because the parliament itself voted that they didn't want nuclear power in the taxonomy. And then you're using this way of a delegated legal act that's below the law and its status, trying to make it even more difficult to oppose it, because now we need an absolute majority. And before it would have been a relative majority. So we do not consider this as democratic. And the conservative MEPs aren't happy about this at all. They were not asked at all. They weren't part of the deal. So this was something that the Commission and the member states just decided between themselves without consulting outside of these two institutions. And so because the conservatives are still feel like the most important player in the parliament, and they have sent letters to the Commission and to the Council, etc., that they wanted to be included, but they weren't. So that's why they're opposed. And Sven, I don't know if I'm quoting you right, but you said, I think, that this is about the transparency of the financial market, and that's true, but that's not all. Because if that was all, it wouldn't be quite such a hot topic. But it is about more than that. It goes beyond that, because for the first time, we're setting standards and criteria. What does it mean? What does sustainable investment mean? Yes, that's something for the financial market, but others could use it too, the same standards. So look, for instance, at public investments. The EU could invest something. So they could use the same standards, because what other standards could they use? So this is not just an instrument for financial markets, but for the very first time, we're setting criteria to define what is sustainable in terms of investments. And if we're saying that investing in gas and nuclear power is sustainable, then I think that's going to be used in the future. Other players are going to try to use it, especially those who are trying to push fossil gas and nuclear power further and continue to use it, because we're seeing those fights and discussions starting in the parliament now and the EP about what's going to be financed. So politically, it's really sensitive, the topic, because it's about who does the future belong to? Only those, does it only belong to those who are compatible with the 1.5 degrees and below the 100 CO2 per hour, or could other players also be part of a sustainable future because they're being greenwashed, and then they're going to receive support, financial support, and taxpayers' money in the future, possibly? So that this is the larger debate, I would say. So if we win, then we really will have dealt the nuclear power sectors and gas sectors a heavy blow, and that's what I'm fighting for. Well, thank you. Many of you probably expected Dilara Burkhardt, but she unfortunately wasn't able to join us, and René Repasi is joining us in her stead. Thank you. That was very spontaneous. Many of you have already listened to our webinars quite often, Europe Calling, and you know him as our legal expert, and he always comes in when it's about the state and government contracts. But now he is an MEP for S&D, for the Social Democrats, for the first time in this legislative period. So this is his role today. I'm looking forward to René's point of view from the point of view of S&D, but of course he's still a law expert. So that's why I'm asking, I'm going to ask you something that has been asked many times in Slido now. A complaint has been brought against this because the Commission shouldn't have been isn't allowed, it says, according to Article 290, among others, to bring such rules in a delegated act. Caro Duisburg, who was Environment Minister of Luxembourg, and another speaker have said that they are going to bring a complaint to the European Court of Justice. So maybe you could say something about that as well. Thank you. Yes, I'm quite happy to be here in my new role, even if it's quite spontaneous, because we only actually agreed on this 2 or 3 hours ago. Well, I started as an MEP in February. I have a seat for the Economic Committee of the Parliament, so that means I can vote tomorrow. So that's one sure vote for the objection, in favor of the objection. And I can also say that S&D as a group have decided to uniformly vote in favor of the objection in both committees, Envy and Econ, Environment and Economics, but especially in Econ, where we might have some candidates that are a little bit more difficult to convince. It's quite a success that the CDU, so the EPP, the European People's Party, the Conservatives have decided to let MEPs vote on their conscience, so vote individuals. So it's going to be quite interesting. And such webinars as this one tonight are quite important for people to give an informed vote. So I'm also in the legal committee in URI, and that's another interesting one. So I'm not going to repeat the substantive point, but another interesting point is the one that you mentioned just now in your question to me, Max. So the Commission is using a technical legal act in order to take a political decision that is very heavy in terms of its political impact. So in the Netherlands, they've decided to build new nuclear power stations, and in Germany, even though we're having a war now, there's still a very clear position against nuclear power. So that is not a technical decision. Very obviously, it's a political decision, and that's your reply to your legal question, because it's a democracy, a question of democracy, an issue of democracy at the end of the day, to differentiate between technical issues and political issues. And the Court of Justice, the European Court of Justice, will also look at that criterion, political decisions. So if it's a political decision, it cannot be in a delegated legal act. Whenever you give a political assessment, and that's in the past, the Court of Justice has condemned delegated acts. So I think it's quite clear in this situation. This is not something that the Commission can do, should have been allowed to do, should be allowed to do in via a delegated act without the public being consulted at all. And I mean, the very fact that they've published it on on New Year's Eve just before midnight shows that they are aware of their own guilty conscience. And the parliament was excluded completely, and that also shows that they knew exactly what they were doing. It's a massive democratic issue, a lack of democracy in this decision. So even just leaving substantive points completely apart, as an MEP, I am against it in principle. And now, if we don't manage to get a majority in the plenary, at the moment I'm carefully optimistic, but if we don't manage to get that in the end, then the coordinators of my group in the Economic and Environment Committee will also bring a complaint as the Parliament. That would then go to the Legal Committee, and they will decide whether it's actually going to happen. And because I knew this, that this might happen, I have already secured the position as a standing rapporteur in the URI committee for such issues. So this democracy issue, I'm working for a broad majority in order to make sure that this complaint of invalidity of this delegated legal act will go through, because it's clear that you can't do that. Citizens don't understand how you can make such an important political decision via a delegated act. I mean, that also shows the Commission doesn't take the Parliament seriously, but we have to take ourselves seriously and show them the red card. And they are trying to just get political decisions through under the guise of a technical delegated act. So for substantive reasons, I will vote for the objection, but also for democracy reasons. And if we don't manage it this way, then we're going to bring this invalidity complaint on another, via the second way that I've just described. And I'm sure that Michael Bloss and others will stand by me, and I'm very sure that we will be successful as a legal expert and professor, and I think that many people will agree with me. So this democracy dimension that political points are being decided via a delegated legal act, making it easy to actually reject this. Thank you. That was very clear. So that the EP is leaning in that direction, and they might also bring an invalidity complaint. That's good news, but maybe you'll be successful tomorrow anyways.
Bevor wir in die Fragen einsteigen, noch einmal in die Runde hier ins
Before we start with the questions, I would like to ask you if any one of you wants to react directly to what has been said, or if you want to emphasize something, if there's something you don't agree with, that could be a good start. So I want to give you this possibility. Everyone's happy? Great. Let's start with the questions then. The question with the highest rating both addresses Sven for the government, let's say, and also Michael Bloss, which is, could you give us an overlook on which EU governments are lobbying for gas and nuclear power, and which interests are behind this. I think Sven would be the right person to answer, if he's okay with this. First of all, I think it can be quite funny if there are consequences when the European Commission doesn't respect the law. It should be quite interesting. And I think, René, if you're right about what you're saying, you should be very careful and watch out for yourself. But that's a very interesting, strong statement. In the Council, the situation is as you would imagine. There has been quite a broad majority of countries who knew they don't have nuclear power plants and also don't plan on building any. And the number of countries with a clear position, however, has been reduced to a very small number. And this kind of problem presents itself with many laws on climate protection. If investments in nuclear energy are to be classified the same way as investments into renewables or investments into hydrogen, this poses quite a problem which affects several topics. This doesn't only apply to the taxonomy, because there are different standards in the different sectors, and we have a strong lobby also in the parliament trying to align this. And it will be very interesting to see how this turns out in the parliament, especially also concerning the renewables directive. I'm not that worried actually, because nuclear energy is just not worth it. So it's rather an ideological project in many countries. The low production costs of the renewables are just something that the nuclear energy can't compete with. So I think this problem will actually solve itself in the long run. The question is how much money will still be lost on investments in nuclear energy. So economically speaking, it's clear to me, but politically, not necessarily. If we're talking about gas, the situation was quite clear. You can simply see which countries are heavily dependent on gas, and this is usually Russian gas in Europe. And this factor has changed the situation. The countries which are heavily dependent on fossil Russian gas now suffer from a certain ideological confusion. They're mostly in Central and Eastern Europe, and these countries, understandably, are very much opposed against Russia and Putin. But it's difficult to say what the exact consequences will be. In any case, we can see that the countries who were more leaning on the gas support are against supporting this in parliament now. It's a small country, small group of countries which are not from Central or Eastern Europe. This means the geography also affects the dependencies, while the situation is different with nuclear energy. There are some countries who never had nuclear energy and never will have, also because it's dangerous, but they somehow made an opening because of ideological reasons. This is what I would give as an overlook. Okay, let's continue directly with several questions directed towards Kristina, but also the others. How much money are we actually talking about is one question. And is this also about public investment? We're talking about sustainable investment. Is this money coming from the government sides? That's one of the questions. How much money is it about in the framework of this transformation? Well, there are different numbers. How costly will the transformation be is actually not the right question. We should ask ourselves how much it costs if we don't initiate this transformation now, which is a necessary transformation. The debate on costs also often is being presented as, can the citizens actually pay for this? And I would say it's actually not too expensive for the citizens to pay for this, but it's too expensive to wait and do nothing. And the taxonomy actually is not a sustainability label, strictly speaking, but rather a transparency system, as Sven said. So if we want to invest in a sustainable way, we have to have a clear definition and an assessment framework, be it public or private investments. And that's what the taxonomy is about and will also have to further develop into. Now it's focusing very much on ecological aspects and climate protection, but you also have to look at social dimensions and biodiversity in the future. This means it's a comprehensive framework defining a common European understanding of sustainability with the goal to make sure that no cent is being invested something that is doing harm to humans and to the planet. But there's no prohibition. It's just about transparency for investments. And this also allows the finance industry to assess risks more comprehensively. Sometimes you're given the impression that the state would actually prohibit certain investments because something is amoral or a bad investment, but that's not how it's working. The idea is to give incentives. If you spend money today, knowing it will never come back, this doesn't help anything. And if it even endangers the foundations of our own existence, it's even worse. So the idea is the state actually has an advantage if we have this comprehensive financing system, and the taxonomy is one essential step into this direction.
Die Taxonomie an sich ist eine hervorragende Idee. Und es darf jetzt
and taxonomy itself is a great idea. But this should not lead to something I hear from Brussels, which is the frustration of this debate on taxonomy leads to less appetite for actually talking about also social taxonomy and other aspects which are very important. And this would be a huge sacrifice if we would have to bring it. Thank you very much. This was a very interesting point. I would actually directly switch to Michael Bloss. How is the situation? Is there an anti-taxonomy mood? Yes, it's difficult to say if we're talking about taxonomy and actually referring to the second delegated act. This is getting even more complicated than the already complicated term taxonomy itself. We also have the social taxonomy, as mentioned. And several times I heard the argument, oh, this is really going to be complicated. Do we really have to go this far? But especially for this reason, the framework of the taxonomy and the classification of sustainable investments is so essential. We have to save the taxonomy in a certain way because this classification has to be usable or has to be made usable. And it certainly doesn't help if nuclear energy and gas are included. This is not good for credibility. So all the other topics like social aspects, agriculture, etc., are also being damaged in their credibility, and the whole project is being dragged down. And one of the reasons of opposing so much was the intent to improve this instrument, because in itself it can be very useful. And each time that there is a classification, you actually get a better overlook of what makes sense and what doesn't. And those investments that are not classified as sustainable don't want a classification where they're not included. So they are trying to take this opportunity. Thank you very much. I'd also take some oral questions. Christian Bernhard has been waiting a long time. Can I just briefly mention something which I saw in different questions? What do we need the taxonomy for? Was the question. We have the recovery and the resilience facility and also the cohesion funds referring to the taxonomy. That means European money should only be used according to the taxonomy rules. And this reference only refers to Article 17, the do no significant harm principles. But delegated acts are actually excluded. So what's being debated now on delegated acts will not affect this. It will not affect the use of European public money, as if the lawmakers in the European Union would actually already have foreseen that someone might misuse this system. And a second point I'd like to add to Sven Giegold's statements. While we're insisting very much on taxonomy, we shouldn't forget that the decisive instruments are especially taxes and public investments, and other financial investments rather accompany this. And it would be very problematic if there is a signal that nuclear energy and gas can just be continued while the other debate is going on. Thank you very much. I'd also like to include Luisa in this debate after this direct reference. Thank you. I'm sitting aside. Now we're being interrupted for a public announcement. Maybe someone else should rather speak at this point. Sorry. Okay. Once the announcement is finished, you can jump in again. So Christian Bernhard can join us now. He has asked a written question. You have the floor. I hope you can hear me. Hello. There are two important topics. Luisa Neubauer mentioned one of them, being that the taxonomy also wants to achieve more democracy in the system. She mentioned the big multinational companies which are undermining democracy if they receive too much support. Nuclear energy and gas are a huge part of the industry, and this is very dangerous. That's one thing. We need more democracy again. And the second topic, I work with many people who are dealing with industry standards. Unfortunately, the connection is interrupted. And in this sector, we can see a lot of uncertainty. We've seen this with the taxonomy, but also with the EFRS rules, with the accountability rules. And especially the big companies already have their own standards, as has been said. What we need is a common set of reliable basic standards. We have 5 different standards and we'll have to see which one will prevail. I might prefer the R3.0 because it's the most advanced, but this might not be possible. We should, however, try to structure these standards and define which standards apply for small and medium enterprises and which for big enterprises. And in the green standards, I'm finishing, I like a lot that there are assessment technologies. This means the companies themselves can assess to what extent they are sustainable and also find solutions for achieving more sustainability while also achieving better prices. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Luisa was nodding, so maybe she would like to say something, and then maybe Kristina after that. Yes, I hope that you can understand me. I thought it was important to underline what Sven Giegold said and Michael Bloss as well, that it's supposed to be a framework of reference. The sound is really bad. I can barely hear it. We'll just try our best. So just about what's happening with that, all the studies that are being published now and reports that show what's happening, so that companies are using these maturity, and major banks believe that they now have to invest in green topics because of the public pressure, but also because that those fossil energy sources are still being used. So there is this huge pressure from the public, but also from governments partly. So they are trying to set greener targets, but I'm so worried now that in 10 to 15 years, we'll find that all of these different topics will fail in all of these areas, even though there is goodwill now, because the reference framework is lacking. So there's no other mechanism to replace this type of framework. It can't be done via taxes, etc. It has to be really an example from this major democracy, that we're not just turning a blind eye. I mean, so much money, billions are being moved all the times, and our lawmakers keeping an eye on what's being promoted this way and what isn't. So it seems innocent, this financial mechanism, but it is anything but. So it's important to also look at who is voting for what, because it is a directional decision. And this taxonomy says it's really quite black and white, what's green and what isn't. So people are voting and saying, oh, maybe this is a step in the right direction, at least, even if it's not perfect, but that's not true. It is counterproductive. So there are going to be major demonstration and also discussions with MEPs in Strasbourg. And of course, Sven, we're also going to look at the investment practices of governments, Sven. Thank you. We're going to continue with Kristina, and Sven has also received a number of questions. Thank you. Just on the question on the various different standards, because I think it was really relevant. I've been working on this for a few years now, and I think we've lost ourselves a little bit because we started with ESG, environmental social governance, and that, I think, is more a bridge because we don't have any complete reporting. So we have that kind of support in order to understand the market and have some major indicators or so to see what's the impact of specific sectors on the world and the effect or impact of the world on specific sectors. But this is something different. So the idea of sustainable is supposed to be integrated, completely integrated in the financial sector. So ESG as a niche will be completely expanded. So that means that we need this kind of taxonomy. The market was really fragmented, and that was good in the beginning, but now we need a more homogeneous market and more integration. So ESG reporting, which is done in parallel to classic situational reports, isn't helping anymore. We really have to put this in the balances to see the entire value-added chains in order to get the pricing right, because we have to look at all the externalities so that non-sustainable behavior will become unattractive. And there's also social sort of pointing out bad behavior. That's another way. So today, if you say, well, I have a great ESG project, then you look great, but it means nothing. It's a way to delude yourself. And it's been said before, this is a competition debate that we're having now about what is sustainable. I mean, there are 19 different taxonomy approaches globally. So if we can actually get a blueprint that is ambitious enough, which forces others to look at it and to be transparent, then if we fail at doing that, then this phase of sustainable finance will just fail and end and phase out. And so now we have this clear political framework and I believe that the innovative potential is there in the sector, but it's not going to take effect without this framework, because the financial sector always grapples with reputation, crisis of reputation, image damage, and not for nothing. And it will really undermine faith in it. And it's going to lead to a completely more broader discussion as well, the democracy discussion. So we need ambitious, binding standards in order to stop this fragmentation and heterogeneity in the ESG framework area. Thank you. Let's look at the written questions and Slido. I'm going to post the link again. It's already in the chat. So the 3 questions that are at the top at the moment are all towards the German government. So Sven, that's on you. You're going to have to answer. You're going to want to answer, I'm sure. So The topic gas and the LNG policy of the federal government isn't against what you wrote and even the compromise in the taxonomy. I'm going to read out the first question, but there are many more questions in the same direction, so I think it's quite clear. So Reinhard Knof asks, what ways are there in order to stop the LNG lobby in Germany before we're going to have up to 12 new LNG terminals and the fail in the energy turnaround? But also, how is the green why will the Green Ministry of Economics not just stop this kind of greenwashing for LNG terminals? Yes. Well, that is the major discussion in Germany, and it's not a debate that can be avoided or that should be avoided. And I think the main issue is the following. LNG, investment in LNG infrastructure are not climate investments, and we're not saying that they are. These are investments in order to become independent of Russian gas, to no longer be dependent on Russian gas. At the same time, we're doing everything we can in order to make progress with renewables and energy saving things. So there are things that we're not doing, for instance, speed restriction. And yes, I'm upset that we're not doing it. But even if we're doing everything we can, it's not going to change anything, because if Putin says that he's turning off the gas, then we're going to be broke. And there's no integrated gas grid. So the LNG infrastructure that we have in Spain and Portugal, that gas cannot be transported to us, to Germany. And as long as we're dependent on gas, it is right for us to get out of this dependency on Putin. That is not a contribution to climate protection, because LNG gas isn't climate friendly. We all knew this. Not in the way it is produced at the moment. It has a more negative effects because you have to liquidize it in order to transport it. And gas infrastructure without LNG has other climate effects. We're also having the issue of tracking for LNG gas, and for classic gas, we have leaks in the pipelines. So fossil gas isn't climate friendly, but we're not saying that it is. That's not the point. So I would like to make the following point, actually. We keep hearing, if you invest in LNG infrastructure now, you're going to stabilize fossil infrastructure in the long term. But that's not what we're doing. We're doing everything in order to really get to this energy transition, and we started a veritable fireworks of measures and laws, and large part of the population is with us. For instance, that we are going to have heat pumps everywhere, because so that we no longer need the gas for heating, and that's mainly what we need it for. And Michael Bloss also mentioned it. We're really trying to create the kinds of investment condition that the industry will also turn away from fossil gas and use renewables, specifically hydrogen, in order to lose that dependency on fossil gas. But these are two different topics. LNG infrastructure isn't going to be labeled green and financed that way. That's not what we're doing. We're not mixing these two things. But it's not great that we're having to make these investments now. Of course, I would prefer not to have to do that. But we did not choose this war that Mr. Putin is waging, and it is our responsibility to make sure that this resource for Putin dries up as fast as possible, and that's why we need the LNG infrastructure. And then another topic, because Bernhard mentioned it, and I've heard it a few times, gas, nuclear, that was major groups. I don't think it's that simple, because nuclear power plants and major fossil investments have never really been made by groups alone, always with massive public support, subsidies, political frameworks. So that means, to put it bluntly, that there is no nuclear power plant purely financed by the market. That's just not something that exists. There's always a kind of political framework that helps it. So it's wrong to say that it's the fault of groups. It's also the political decision of parties, parliaments, voters who created the conditions for this system that we are now trying to transform step by step in a decentralized system of renewables. Thank you.
Dann kann ich mir vorstellen, dass es, Luisa, willst du darauf reagieren?
Luisa, would you like to react to this? Maybe that would be interesting at this point.
Ja, ich muss ein bisschen stillos brüllen. Ich kann berichten, ich frage mich gerade, ob das so eine wahnsinnig schlechte für die, also eine Gegenwerbung gegen die Bahn wird hier gerade.
I think I'm not really making the train very popular at the moment because she says, and it's true because the connection is gone. Maybe she'll be back, but I think she's in Austria now, so that's Austrian internet. That's probably not going to work. But yes, Michael Bloss, the next question to you that was also voted high. Russia's influence on the taxonomy decision. And there's a study on that. So, Michael, maybe you could say something on this so that we have the security policy aspect that also plays a role here. Well, I think it's interesting that Luisa's internet was as good at it as it was for so long. But yes, a new topic. Sven just said it. It's always a mix of companies, groups, and states in order that tries to promote their interests. But the main source of gas for Europe is Putin, and that's why they were so interested in making sure that gas would be part of the taxonomy so that we keep buying it. And Greenpeace reported on that after investigating all of this and looking at the topic, and they found that ever since the taxonomy was published in 2018, Gazprom, Germania, Nord Stream 2, Lukoil, etc., so Russian gas companies, their subsidiaries, etc., had 18 meetings with the Commission, always with the goal to make sure that the taxonomy still includes gas so that Russian gas company will still have a future.
Wenn diese Taxonomie, wie sie jetzt geschrieben ist, wenn sie so kommt, dann können diese russischen Gasunternehmen davon profitieren. Also,
so if we get the taxonomy that is on the table now, they will still benefit. They will still make 4 billion euros per year if we get the green label or the eco label for such gas investments. So that's what they would make. So in terms of their survival, that is quite important, that gas stays on the table. And that's what they lobbied for. I mean, it's normal, but it shows that the gas and the European dependency on gas in the taxonomy is a result of political lobbying. It's in the interest of Russia, and we have to get away from this. It's something from the past where Russia always delivered cheap gas, but we can't afford to keep doing that and continue to finance this war. So these lobbyists were successful in the past, and especially in the East, for Eastern European colleagues, that has really made them think again, because they're realizing, and in the Energy Industrial Committee, I've had these discussions so many times, and gas has always been the bridge. They wanted to invest in gas first and then renewables, but now, bit by bit, this consensus around gas is breaking up because it comes from Russia. So it's clear that gas is not just bad for the climate and being in the taxonomy, but also geopolitically, we have to wonder, can we really afford to use gas as a bridging technology in the transitional period? Of course, if we don't use gas, then the bridge will be much shorter or not even there at all. And I believe that there's a change coming in the position in Eastern Europe. It's not completely there yet. It's not in every debate that we're having at the moment that people really change their position and saying, we really want to go full speed renewables. But it is interesting that the solar obligation that the Commission proposed, that the PS party from European countries agreed with that. So there used to be an Eastern European gas lobby, and we're overcoming this slowly. But they're partially the reason that gas was in there now.
Thank you very much. Luisa, are you connected again? We could try a second time. Well, your connection until now was actually rather publicity for the trains. Okay, I'll try quickly. Just a brief comment on the global fossil expansion. This is very worrying. This could constitute a backlash, especially the LNG expansion in Germany is being criticized, and a law with up to 12 LNG terminals, which will have a severely disrupt our CO2 balance, is really delusional, or actually advertising gas as a transition technology. Obviously, we have to get away from Putin. This holds true, but what we're living now is a huge step back, and millions being spent the wrong way and lost, and there's a clear lack of an exit strategy. And especially the fixed LNG terminals aren't of any use, as economic experts point out. They should not be built. They don't fit our modern times, and the whole development is very worrying. And Germany doesn't fare very well in this aspect. Thank you. This was technically great and also content-wise, as usual. I think we're coming into the final phase slowly. I have a question for René from Manuela Troschke concerning your action for annulment at the Parliament. There has been a lot of enthusiasm, and the comment is an action for annulment would actually be a novelty. What are the chances for success? And there's also a general question on how you could limit the power of the European Commission. Is this actually possible, or will there also be counter reactions? What do you think? I think Sven's reaction to my statement already shows us that there is often action and reaction. So obviously some won't be very amused with my idea. I'm only participating since February, so sometimes I have to hold back a bit. I'm rather an expert in science than in politics for now, although improving. During the first weeks, I especially got angry at the arrogance of the European Commission towards the Parliament. I could name many examples, as could Michael Bloss, I think. And once I cooled off a bit, I wondered where this arrogance stems from. It's probably because the Parliament and the MEPs also don't take themselves completely serious. Many of them see themselves as a small part of this whole lawmaking machinery, and many are not confident enough, don't say no enough. We always ask for more rights for the Parliament, but to be honest and a bit mean, we don't use the majority of the 70 rights we actually have. And when the European Commission is making laws and presenting expert opinions which disregard us, we should also just make a stand and say, okay, we'll head towards the European Court of Justice. In the German Parliament, you also present cases to the tribunals, and we also should do this more often. It's called strategic litigation, and we should just say, if you don't take us seriously enough, we'll take legal action. And many other MEPs are of the same opinion. I think this legal act is an excellent example. Across the different political groups, we are finding unity in our reaction, which is, it's not up to the European Commission to decide on this alone. And during the 80s, for example, the European Court of Justice gave a right to legal action to the Parliament on basically anything. And now we have a new opportunity. Is this a novelty? Well, there have been some legal actions of the Parliament against certain technical aspects, but it was rather about details. I am referring myself to an action against a legal act, and the court's ruling was, if there's a competency transfer to the European Commission, the lawmaking can't be done via a delegated act if it's policy making. And here with the taxonomy, we have a clear case of policy making. So somehow there's a small voice inside me. It could be interesting if this doesn't go through, but the political scientists inside me is just thinking we should do the right thing. That's the most important aspect. Okay, thank you very much. Sven is already nervous. Well, just kidding, he never is, but I think I should still give him the chance to react to what Luisa said. And before you speak, I would also like to quote oral question. Sandra Gerdes wanted to ask an oral question. I'd like to give her the floor and let Sven react, and afterwards all of you can speak again and we'd slowly finish. Sandra Gerdes, you're the next to have the floor.
Hallo, ja, man hört Sie gut, bitte.
Hello, can you hear me? Great. I have a question for Mr. René Repasi. I've been listening very closely what you said about the action for annulment. This is very interesting, but you should also think about what the consequences would be. Basically, the European legislator would have to decide again in a legislative procedure, and again, we would need the majorities we didn't obtain in the plenary. So I ask myself the question, what we can actually achieve, and if we shouldn't rather focus on something else. Nuclear power and gas somehow now have infiltrated the taxonomy, but maybe we can do something different. Maybe in Germany there could be a bottom-up approach, saying the EU isn't able to do this correctly, so we'll have a strong, more strict label on our national level. Are there ideas like this in the German parliament, and would a majority be possible? Thank you very much. I think we should split this question. The third part should go to René Repasi, and then the consequences, procedure, veto, etc. Also for René, but the question for a stricter German label and a bottom-up approach would rather be a question for Kristina, I think. So I'd like to give the floor to René again. Also beginning the clean-nosing remarks. If something can't be decided on a technical level anymore, it passes on to the political level, and then it will be decided according to the majorities that exist due to the voters. But that doesn't mean that it's already clear how this is going to turn out, and that nuclear energy and gas will be in a main regulation on taxonomy. If I remember correctly, what I mentioned about legislation, there has been an intent to directly include this in the taxonomy, and this failed. So there was a majority on the legislators level. Sven might correct me here. And then we have this foul compromise with the delegated act, but it's impossible to say how this will develop. You always have to fight for your majorities in policy. So that's a really abstract level. But more concretely, if we can bury this delegated act, that would be great. But it wouldn't change the fact that we as a parliament are often too lazy and just move something to a delegated act, and the Commission is inflated with power she doesn't deserve, actually. So it will be political in any case, but you can't say in which direction this will go. It will depend on the majorities. Thank you very much. Kristina, if the EU label isn't good enough, would a stricter German label be a good idea? Yes, that's a very interesting question. I'd like to consider it more broadly. European financing activities and the taxonomy are only as strong as the ambition level of the member states, and the ambition level in Germany concerning sustainable finance is very low on a political level. This applies to the last government. If we're looking at the current government, this might change, and they're stating our system should lead to a more sustainable financing system. The question is, can we already satisfy the transformation needs in Germany, and are we brave enough to include this in a European debate? And I think the answers are no and no. As you said, I was a deputy president of the advisory council for the government, and we presented 31 recommendations, for example, climate targets for the public investments, clear indicators for ESG in financial products, etc. And the last governments finally adopted 26 measures. This is the sustainable finance strategy of the German governments. But since the publication in May, nothing happened. I'm in this advisory board again. I'm very happy about this role. But the first meeting was only about formal aspects. This took place last Friday. So I can't say yet how the content will develop. We have 31 recommendations, 26 measures, as I said, and one clear need that between BMF and BMAK, there is a strong coordination. And until now, the BMAK wasn't very visible in this process. I hope this will change, because we can talk a lot about Europe, but we also have to ask ourselves, which responsibility do we bear as a member state, and did we push enough in the decisive moments? In 2016, we had the high-level experts group in the European Union, and only in 2019, there was the advisory board in Germany. And the opinion is still the market will eventually fix it. The connection is interrupted. Yeah, only the last sentence was lost. You're observing the market for 13 years now, but it won't fix it. So national standards can help us also with international endeavors, and it can be a clear push towards the European Union. Thank you. Sven. That's a long list of questions and topics. Let's start with something a bit more fun. René, if this should fail in the European Parliament and you can't go to the Court of Justice, then I still have a long list of other possible areas for legal action out of my 12 years of activity. And all of these are examples of cases where the European Commission doesn't respect the law. And then the lady who asked a question said, we would need the same majority again. But this is underestimating the legal experts in the parliament, because the committee in which René works, we really have the guardians of self-empowerment. And we have a small group of legal experts, such as René, and they control if the parliament will be able to take legal action or no. They have a prerogative power, and I think they will use it. And there seldomly have been majorities. And maybe we should be as confident as the German parliament, the Bundestag, because there you have a right to file a legal action as a minority. And this right is actually being exerted quite often. But in the parliament, it's different. You always need a majority, even if in the small legal committee. There are many examples for violations of environmental law and other laws. And as a member of the German government, I can't to be explicit about this, but I have a very long list. So lots of fun and all the best from my side. But let's be serious. Should we add a German standard to the European taxonomy? If this actually fails, something like taxonomy plus could be an option. So we wouldn't bury the taxonomy because of the adoption of the delegated act, but we make sure that in Germany, it becomes visible, as in all financial institutions, that we don't want this additional rules for nuclear power and energy. And this would mean that the Green and Sustainable Finance Cluster, great name, Kristina, that this cluster would say there's a need for something like this. And I would also support this in the government. But as you say, as the climate ministerium, we're not leading on sustainable finance. Leading is instead the finance ministry and the environmental ministry. So I can only accompany this process. However, we still had a certain influence on the nominations for this advisory board, and you are certainly also happy about it, although I can't disclose more. And besides, you're completely right. The recommendations from this advisory board have not really been used. Now we have a new government and a new advisory board. And my ministry also would like to advance faster in this area. And then you have to ask yourself, what's the German position on European lawmaking? And the question is, should Germany always be in the small group that's imposing stricter rules? For example, reporting requirements for companies. And there are many more legislative projects that are relevant. And in a cross-cutting approach with Fit for 55, we work towards the greenwashing of nuclear power and gas not being possible. And this also applies to hydrogen. And I also don't want to avoid the delicate question, Luisa, but I think this is not a step back. I was really serious about what I said. We can have different opinions, but it is not a step back. And that's because our investment agenda on energy efficiency and climate protection will be accelerated. Given Putin's war and the breach of international law. So there's not a step back. And then the number of 12 LNG terminals, this is really the worst case scenario, but it will probably not come to this. We can also talk about this with a good bottle of wine, Luisa, but I can assure you there won't be 12 LNG terminals in Germany. It could also be a bottle of Austrian wine. In any case, it won't be 12 terminals. The question is, why do we build those terminals in the first place? I'm also responsible for this. And your argument was there shouldn't be fixed terminals. The most are actually floating terminals, which can be dismantled quickly. The fixed terminals have the advantage that this infrastructure can be reused for other purposes, for hydrogen. This means new costs because it's not the identical infrastructure, but the installations on land can also be used for the global hydrogen market. Not all of it. There will be a need for new investments, but both for the floating terminals as for the fixed terminals, this is an investment in our independency from less friendly suppliers, and it's not a step back. And if you say the German government is not decisive enough, then I think you don't take our agenda seriously. And the difference to the former German government is really evident. And one last comment.
Offen mal klar und deutlich zu sagen, im Verhältnis zur Klimakrise ist das, was wir machen, immer noch zu wenig.
We also have to be very clear. Looking at the actual climate crisis, what we're doing isn't enough. And if you look a few years back where we were in Europe and in Germany, we have made a big step forward, even if it's not enough. So if you don't acknowledge that, then people will be frustrated. Of course, the first reason why people are frustrated is because we're not doing enough. And of course, I suffer from that. It makes me just as sad as everybody else who wants climate protection. But the movement that you helped build has achieved a lot. And in my environment around me, I see a lot of people who no longer feel that democratic effort and using your democratic voice doesn't have a point and isn't yielding any results. And so, of course, you can be frustrated by the fact that you haven't achieved everything you wanted to, but you also have to acknowledge what you have achieved. Otherwise, people will just stop even trying. And Germany is leading worldwide in terms of using renewables. So that is the main factor in our government. So once the cameras are switched off, people ask me, global conferences, how are you going to achieve 100% renewables, even if the topic before was nuclear powers? Could you give us technical expertise? And I think it's interesting. If the fourth largest industrial country worldwide is really transitioning to renewables completely, then that is a success and has to be said too. Thank you, Sven. So directly over to Luisa, and then Michael will conclude. Luisa doesn't. I think it's okay that we have different views on this. As always, it's important to emphasize, it's not that I wake up in the morning and thinking the climate balance of Germany is bad. No, it's reports, rankings, etc., studies that make that clear. And I know that the government is heterogeneous, and the money that's investment in expanding motorways and LNG, discounts for petrol, etc., that also has to be seen. And the LNG, these are fossil investments in the first place. And that is a situation that you have to face and you can't just ignore. So I'm just wondering who is going to stop this and who's going to prevent it. So that's what we're wondering, and that's why we're protesting against it, because it's not enough to make a big steps forward and building a fixed LNG infrastructure that could be used for hydrogen. Well, that's not a step in the right direction. It's just taking the wrong turn. It's like moving from Munich to Hamburg, but building a house in Frankfurt on the way there. So yes, the quick solution would be floating LNGs as a part of fix, but also renewables, because that is another thing that has to be changed in public protection. You can be faster with that. And one thing is that, yes, energy savings are a little bit on the agenda now, but that's an area you can do a lot more. And then this big deal with Qatar, with the biggest gas field worldwide, that is another thing. So this is a global trend towards fossil fuels again. And it's not clear that Germany will really stand against it. And we will be the first to applaud Germany if they do stand against it. But there's really a lot that needs to be done in this important year, 2022, to turn it around. And it's really the year where a lot is at risk, and I'm worried that it's the year where we'll going to slide back or take this wrong turn. But yes, if you're building LNG, then if you're having this vote tomorrow, that is one important first step in battling fossil fuels. Sven has to leave, so yes, you have to go. You're fine. But Michael, you wanted to conclude? And for Europe Calling, on behalf of Europe Calling, I'm going to say thank you right now. We, in the end, had 2,500, 600 people. In the end, it was a very interesting discussion. I've learned a lot. We had new thoughts today, so it was really interesting. Thank you to everyone. And now, Michael Bloss, to conclude. Yes, I would also like to thank everyone. One thing we've learned is that Luisa followed the webinar for 2 hours from the train, and her connection held. That's really impressive. But what she said is Sven said is also a good conclusion. We're really battling, and what Luisa said, the fossil fuels are on the rise again, and we're really fighting against it. And this biggest climate protection instrument that we've ever had in Europe, we had to vote against last week. And so it's back to the committees. Now, there was no position. So we have this opportunity to say stop together in this question, what is going to be labeled sustainable? So what's going to be sustainable in the future? We can say stop here, it's not gas and it's not nuclear. I think that's really important. And looking at the figures that we've just received, I am a little bit optimistic that we may win tomorrow at 12, and then we can celebrate tomorrow night if the committees vote against, and then we still have 2 weeks until the plenary. And that is also time for the movement to breathe and to take a bit of strength, because we will see that we can win. We'll have the fight and discussion in the parliament and on the streets with the movement. So we'll need everyone in the society, also the conservative parties. So this webinar was really fun for me. Thanks to everyone. Thank you to everyone for participating. And I learned a lot about complexity, fossil capitalism, democracy. Yes, well, I think that's going to be the issue tomorrow. Who does the future belong to? To renewables, or will fossil fuels and nuclear power get their share as well? And I hope it's going to be renewables. So I hope we'll win tomorrow, and then in 3 weeks to 2 weeks, we'll win the plenary vote as well. Thank you for coming. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. Thank you.